that a chain? In the middle of the woods. Joanna Hale blinked, squinting into the mist just past the pine grove. The leash her dog tugged on had stopped short ears, perked tails stiff. It was still early. The trail was silent. And there, hidden between two fallen logs, was something she never expected to see on a quiet spring morning in North Carolina. A glint of rust, a whisper of breath, and a pair of eyes wild, starving, and almost too weak to hold their gaze. This wasn't a house cat. This wasn't a pet gone missing. This was a baby bobcat, chained. Somehow, impossibly, someone had tethered a wild creature to a post deep in the forest and left her there. No food, no water, no tracks nearby, just silence and survival. Joanna stepped closer. The wind shifted. The bobcat didn't flinch. Later, she would say it felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath. There are stories that unfold gently like leaves in spring, and then there are the ones that start with a shock to your soul, a cry you almost don't hear until you're close enough to care. This is that kind of story. A true story about a wild cat baby abandoned but unbroken. About second chances, unlikely friendships, and the quiet power of stopping to notice. And what happened after this moment? Well, that part might just restore your faith in everything. Let me take you back to where it began. Joanna Hale never intended to walk that far into the woods. She usually stayed on the marked trail, especially after the winter storms had littered the forest floor with broken limbs and half-toppled saplings. But that morning felt different. Her dog Lucky had tugged insistently, leading her deeper than usual past the creek bed over a narrow ridge until the sounds of the town vanished behind the trees. The air was still, cold but not sharp. The kind of quiet that presses against your skin. That's when she saw it, just a flicker at first. Metal against bark. A rusted chain looped tight around an old cedar post, half buried in moss. And at the end of it, slumped against the ground like a fallen shadow, was an animal. Joanna thought it might be a raccoon, maybe a stray dog. She stepped closer. What she saw made her heart stutter. It was a bobcat. Small. Too small. Its ribs pressed through a thin layer of fur patches, missing along its flank. One paw curled awkwardly inward. Its head drooped low, but the eyes, those amber eyes, watched her. Not with fear, not even with fight, just exhaustion. She didn't move. She didn't speak. For a moment, the two of them simply breathed the same air, separated by 5 feet of space and what felt like the entire weight of the world. Then Joanna whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. I see you." That one line stayed with her. It had come out of her mouth before she'd even thought it. A reflex, like she wasn't speaking to a bobcat at all, but to something more fragile, something sacred. She backed away slowly, hands raised. Lucky didn't bark, didn't growl. He just sat beside her, alert and still. Joanna reached into her coat and pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled as she tapped the contact for Blue Ridge Wildlife Response, a number she'd saved years ago after seeing a flyer in a vet's office. She never thought she'd use it. The dispatcher listened carefully, asked only what needed to be asked. Location, condition, movement, then said, "Stay with her, don't touch her, help is on the way." The wait was 22 minutes. Joanna kept count in her head. 22 minutes, kneeling on the pine needles, speaking softly to a wild animal she'd never met. Telling her the names of the flowers starting to bloom. The soup she planned to make that evening, her husband's favorite trail through these woods before he passed. The bobcat never moved, but her ears twitched, her breath stayed steady. Help arrived in the form of a dusty blue truck and a man named Travis Miles, senior field officer with the wildlife team. He greeted Joanna with a nod and calm confidence, like he'd walked into scenes like this before, but never took them for granted. "She's young," he murmured, approaching slowly. "Maybe 8 months. Looks like she's been out here for days." Joanna asked how he could tell. The eyes, he said simply. "They give up last." The rescue itself was precise and practiced. Travis sedated the bobcat carefully, whispering to her as he moved. He used a warm blanket to cover her body, then inspected the chain. It wasn't tied, it was padlocked. Whoever had done this hadn't wanted her to wander off, but they hadn't wanted to be found either. That fact stayed with Joanna. Still does. Once the bobcat, now sedated, was safely in the crate, Travis carried her to the truck. Joanna followed, eyes fixed on the still figure. Before the doors closed, she asked if she could see her one more time. Travis nodded. "She'll pull through," he said gently. "But she'll need time and care. A lot of both." He paused. "We'll give her a name at the sanctuary. You gave her the first kindness." Joanna nodded. Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. Not yet. What happened in those woods wasn't just a rescue, it was a crossroads. This kind of abandonment isn't rare. It's just rarely seen. Across the US, there are thousands of reports every year of wild animals, especially big cats like bobcats being kept as illegal pets. Most are taken as kittens when they're small and quiet and cute. But they don't stay that way. At around 6 months, a wild bobcat begins to show its instincts. They become territorial, unpredictable. And if raised in captivity, they lack the fear of humans that would normally keep them out of reach. Some people respond by locking them up. Others let them loose in neighborhoods or backwoods, and some chain them. According to the Humane Society, more than 7,000 wild cats, from bobcats to tigers, are currently in private hands in the US, many illegally. When things go wrong, the animals suffer first, and quietly. What's harder to measure is the why. Why would someone go through the effort of keeping a bobcat only to abandon it like garbage? The answers are never simple. Some people think they're saving the animal from the wild. Others imagine they can raise a wild cat the same way they'd raise a dog. A few heartbreakingly do it for attention, novelty, or online clout. But none of those reasons excuse the result. Left alone in a forest, chained, unable to hunt or flee, the bobcat Joanna found would not have lasted another day. There's a small lesson tucked into this moment, one Joanna didn't realize she'd learn until much later. The act of noticing can be life-saving. She could have ignored that path, could have blamed Lucky's restlessness and turned around. She could have walked right past a tangle of chain and bark and never known what was curled beneath it. But she didn't. She stopped. She noticed. And in that small human moment, she offered something that would change everything witnessed. There's a quiet dignity in bearing witness to suffering, and an even deeper one in choosing to respond. That's what animal rescue often is. Not loud, not heroic in the cinematic sense, but deeply human. And Joanna had just stepped into something she hadn't expected, a story that would reach far beyond one broken animal in one forgotten patch of woods. A story that, though she didn't know it yet, was only just beginning. As Travis drove off with the sleeping bobcat in the back of his truck, Joanna stood at the forest's edge, heart pounding, mind racing, wondering who this animal had been before the chain. She didn't yet know her name would become Nova, or that Nova's story would become something far bigger than survival. All she knew as the birds slowly returned to the branches and Lucky sat quietly beside her was this: that wild cat had seen her, and she had seen the wild cat. We journey into a bigger truth, one that connects thousands of rescues like Nova's into a hidden epidemic. In the next chapter, we'll explore the silent crisis of exotic animal abandonment in America, and why this story isn't as rare as you might hope. The phone didn't stop ringing at Haven Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary for 3 days after Nova was found. Some callers had heard whispers a baby bobcat rescued from the woods. Others asked if they could donate supplies. A few just wanted to say thank you. One woman called in tears, recalling the feral kitten she'd tried to raise years ago. "I didn't know what I was doing," she said. "I thought love was enough." It was Travis who noticed the pattern first. "This isn't just about Nova," he said one evening, sorting through intake forms at the sanctuary's small office. "She's part of something bigger, something nobody really wants to talk about." And he was right. Every year in the US, Tens of thousands of animals classified as exotic, from reptiles to monkeys to wildcats, are purchased, bred, or smuggled into homes. Some are kept in backyard cages. Others sleep on living room rugs. A few end up as social media novelties: a bobcat licking peanut butter from a spoon, a cougar lounging beside a baby. The novelty doesn't last. Eventually, instincts return. The animal grows larger, stronger, more unpredictable. That's when the surrender calls begin, or worse, the abandonment. According to the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, ASPCA, more than 3.2 million cats are surrendered or abandoned annually, and a growing number of those cases involve hybrid or wild species bobcats, servals, lynx. These aren't domesticated pets. They're predators built for survival, and yet they're often treated like toys. That's what happened to Nova. There's no clear record of who chained her to that post. No fingerprints, no camera, but the signs tell a story. Travis believes she was raised in captivity, possibly acquired online. She wasn't afraid of humans, he said. Not at first. That's usually a sign they've been handled too much too early. Someone likely bought her or found her as a cub and tried to raise her indoors. Maybe they fed her raw chicken and posted videos online. Maybe she scratched furniture. Maybe she bit someone. Or maybe one day they just couldn't deal anymore. And so they drove out into the forest, chained her, and left. It's a dark reality, and not the one people want to hear. Because we love cute animal videos, we click on them by the millions. Baby bobcat yawning in a sunbeam. Wildcat baby taking a bath in a kitchen sink. They tug at our hearts. They're comforting, familiar, but often they're not what they seem. There's a reason sanctuaries like Haven Ridge have begun quietly collaborating with YouTube channels and social platforms to offer context, caution, and ethics behind the footage. As Nova's story spread, a handful of creators even reached out asking how they could be part of the solution, not just the spectacle. Because the truth is, many of these wild animals are suffering behind the screen. And if Nova hadn't been found, her story wouldn't have made it past a tree line. There's a real-life case that sticks with Travis. 4 years ago, in a nearby state, a family bought a male bobcat cub through a private online breeder. They named him Jasper. For the first few months, things were manageable. He slept in a playpen, followed the kids around, even used a litter box. But by month 6, Jasper had begun marking territory, spraying walls, clawing at the couch, lashing out unpredictably. The family didn't abuse him. They weren't cruel. They were simply unprepared. They tried to rehome him, but no licensed facilities had space. In desperation, they posted on a local forum, "Free Bobcat. Friendly needs room." Jasper never made it to a sanctuary. He was later found dead near a highway, hit by a car, wearing a collar still intact. That story doesn't go viral, but it's the more common one. People often ask Joanna if she believes Nova's former owner meant harm. Her answer is always the same. I don't think they knew better, but not knowing doesn't erase the pain. There's a lesson tucked into that, a quiet one. We assume that intention is enough, that good people can't cause harm if they mean well. But when it comes to animals, especially wild animals, intent without knowledge can be fatal. The deeper issue here is access. It's shockingly easy to purchase exotic animals online in the US, no questions asked. Some websites sell bobcat cubs for under $2,000 with vague promises of tame temperament and raised around children. Few mention licensing. Fewer still talk about legality. Each state has different laws. Some, like North Carolina, require only minimal paperwork. Others, like California and New York, have banned exotic pet ownership altogether. But enforcement is inconsistent and penalties are often light. That means wild cats like Nova slip through the cracks, raised in kitchens, traded at flea markets, photographed for content, until one day they become inconvenient, and then they're dumped, or worse. What made Nova's story different wasn't just that she was found. It's that someone noticed in time, that small moment, Joanna taking the wrong trail. Lucky pulling a little harder. A woman stopping instead of walking by it changed everything. But it also revealed something important. The crisis isn't just the abandonment. It's the invisibility. For every bobcat rescued, there are likely a dozen more that go unnoticed, chained behind sheds, locked in sheds, left in the woods just far enough away from roads that no one hears them cry. When sanctuaries like Haven Ridge take in animals like Nova, they don't just offer food and medicine. They restore identity. They teach the public what's been forgotten, that wild animals are not entertainment. They're not accessories. They're not blank slates waiting to be named. They are their own beings, with needs, instincts, boundaries, and histories we may never fully know. Since Nova's rescue, the team at Haven Ridge has seen a 36% increase in reported wildlife sightings, many involving suspected illegal pets. The local sheriff's office has begun working with the sanctuary to help identify unlicensed owners. A hotline was established. Community awareness sessions launched at the public library. And Nova unknowingly became a symbol. Her recovery sparked not just concern, but curiosity and then responsibility. It's easy to fall in love with a photo of a wild cat curled on a blanket. Harder to ask where she came from and what she lost to be there. But that shift from love to action is where healing begins. Not just for the animal, but for the people around her too. Joanna still keeps a copy of Nova's intake report in her drawer. Not because she wants to relive the pain of that day, but because she never wants to forget how fragile it all was. How close Nova came to disappearing, how many others still do, and how sometimes saving a life starts with asking the question, should this animal even be here? In the next chapter of this story, we leave the forest and step into the sanctuary, the place where the real work begins. Behind those quiet walls, healing doesn't happen in a single day. It's a slow, patient unfolding. One that begins with food, shelter, and warmth, but ultimately depends on something much deeper: trust. Next, we follow Nova into the arms of those who will care for her and learn what it truly takes to bring a wounded creature back from the edge. Theme: the medical and emotional recovery. At first, Nova wouldn't eat. Even after the sedatives wore off and the IVs were removed, she lay curled in the corner of her recovery enclosure, nose tucked beneath her foreleg, motionless except for the rise and fall of her ribs. She blinked, but she didn't look. She breathed, but she didn't respond. Dr. Emery Green called it shutdown mode. He'd seen it before in wild animals that had been caged, neglected, or abandoned. It's not just physical exhaustion, he told Joanna one morning as they stood outside the viewing panel. It's something deeper. She's not deciding whether to fight or flee. She's deciding if anything is worth responding to at all. Joanna didn't speak. She just watched Nova motionless in the shadows. The staff at Haven Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary followed a specific protocol for cases like Nova's. The first 48 hours were critical. Not just for hydration and stabilization, but for assessing behavior, how the animal responded to sound-light proximity, whether she growled or flinched or stared, whether she ate alone, whether she touched the toys. Nova did none of it. Travis brought in branches from the same forest where she'd been found, hoping a familiar scent would stir her senses. One volunteer placed a plush mouse in the corner. Nova ignored it. Another tried raw quail, then boiled chicken, then sardines. Nothing. Joanna came every day. Not as a guest, she'd signed up to volunteer after the second visit. She helped fold laundry, clean the rabbit enclosure, refilled grain bins. She didn't ask for updates unless offered, but each evening before she left, she'd walk quietly to Nova's enclosure and just sit. Sometimes she read out loud. Sometimes she hummed. Mostly, she waited. It was on the 7th day that Nova finally lifted her head when Joanna entered the room. Not fast, not startled, just a subtle shift, enough to notice. "She's watching you now," Travis said later. That's a good sign. The physical side of recovery was slow but straightforward. Nova had mild anemia from malnutrition, flea dermatitis, and abrasions from the collar. The chain had left a dark indentation around her neck, but there was no infection. Her teeth were in good shape, no broken bones. But her behavior, that was another story. Wild cats raised in captivity exist in a strange limbo. They're not truly tame, but they're not wild anymore either. Their instincts are scrambled, trust is tangled, and too often they've learned that humans mean confusion, confinement, and sometimes harm. Dr. Green explained it like this: a wild animal learns through patterns. When those patterns break, especially when they're forced into dependency, they either adapt or shut down. Nova had shut down. It reminded Joanna of something she'd once read in a trauma recovery book after her husband died. When survival is all you know, rest feels dangerous, connection feels impossible. Watching Nova, she felt that echo. A week later, a breakthrough. Joanna entered the enclosure with a dish of shredded turkey, placed it gently near the wall, then backed away slowly, keeping her eyes down. She sat on the bench, pulled out a worn paperback, and began to read softly, evenly. A sound interrupted her halfway through the second paragraph. Not a growl, not a meow, a soft shuffle. Joanna glanced up. Nova was eating, not quickly, not desperately, but intentionally, as if some part of her had decided that maybe, just maybe, she was safe enough to be hungry. There's a real-life example the team at Haven Ridge often shares in their training workshops. Years ago, they rescued a young serval named Zane from a private roadside zoo. Zane had spent most of his early life pacing a 4x6 wire cage fed only twice a week. When he arrived, his body was thin, but his spirit was thinner. It took 9 months before he made eye contact with a human again. Healing doesn't follow a timeline. For wild animals, especially those raised improperly, the loss of autonomy cuts deeper than most people realize. It's not just about food or shelter. It's about control, about reclaiming the right to choose when to sleep, where to walk, who to trust. That's what the sanctuary gave Nova space to choose again. And slowly she began to. She started shifting positions at night, then responding to sound, then investigating enrichment objects, a pine cone tied to a string, a cardboard box stuffed with hay. One afternoon, she rubbed her head against the wooden wall. Just once. Marking Dr. Green said, watching the footage. That means she's claiming this as part of her territory. Claiming meant confidence. Confidence meant progress. For Joanna, every small sign felt like a miracle. A blink, a stretch, a glance. The first time Nova drank water while Joanna sat nearby, she felt her breath catch. It's like being trusted by something that owes you nothing, she told Travis. It's humbling, he nodded. It's also rare. There's a quiet lesson in this part of the story, one that stretches beyond animal rescue. When we stop demanding progress and simply offer presence, healing finds its own rhythm. It's not always visible. It's rarely fast. But it happens in the pauses, the patience, the earned safety. Joanna never tried to touch Nova, never reached out. She didn't need to. What she offered wasn't dominance or affection, it was respect. And respect for a creature whose only known confinement can feel like freedom. By the end of the first month, Nova had gained weight. Her coat had softened. She'd begun using the scratching post and responded to her name when called, though she still didn't approach. That was okay. The goal wasn't to turn Nova into a pet. It was to help her become whole again. Dr. Green often reminded the team, "We don't fix animals, we give them the conditions to heal." That philosophy shaped everything at Haven Ridge. But just as Nova began to find her rhythm, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. No return address, just a note written in pen. "I think the bobcat is ours." Joanna read the words 3 times before she handed them to Travis. There were no details, no photos, no claim of wrongdoing, just a line of hesitant ink that suggested someone somewhere was watching. The staff discussed protocol. They would investigate, of course. Cross-check microchip data, medical records, any prior ownership history. But no assumptions could be made. Not yet. Still, the timing was jarring. For weeks, Nova had existed in a quiet cocoon of recovery. Now, suddenly, the outside world was reaching in again. Joanna tried not to worry. She told herself it was probably a mistake, a coincidence. But part of her knew better. Next, we step into the bond that began to form not just between woman and wildcat, but between a wounded animal and a town that started to notice her. Because as Nova healed, something strange happened. People began to heal with her. How one bobcat's quiet resilience stirred a ripple in her community and gave rise to something no one saw coming. Joanna told herself she was just checking in, dropping by the sanctuary between errands. A quick hello, nothing more. But then, just checking turned into sitting quietly outside Nova's enclosure for an hour each afternoon, thermos in hand. Then came the day she forgot her tea altogether and stayed until closing. It was never planned. It was something else entirely. Something she couldn't name but felt in her bones. By that point, Nova had started eating more consistently. She moved freely around the enclosure, especially in the late afternoon. She was no longer hiding in corners. And when Joanna arrived, she didn't slink away, she watched. It was a still kind of watching. The kind that made you feel like you were being weighed, not judged. And one day, as Joanna sat with her journal open but untouched, Nova walked toward the fence and lay down only 3 feet away. Travis saw it from the observation room. He didn't say anything right away. He just let it happen. That's a shift, he finally said to Dr. Green later that evening. That's her choosing. It wasn't love in the traditional sense. Wild animals don't bond the way domestic pets do, but there was something unfolding and understanding, a sense of familiarity, of safety. Dr. Green explained it one day during a staff lunch. Some animals imprint early, especially when raised in unstable or captive environments. But what we're seeing with Nova isn't imprinting, it's something called selective trust. She's forming a pattern associating one presence with predictability and calm. He paused. It's rare in wildcats, but not impossible. And it wasn't one-sided. Joanna found herself rearranging her week to be there. Not to help necessarily, though she still volunteered, but to be near Nova, to sit in the quiet, to read aloud, to listen to the small, grounding sounds of sanctuary life. The tap of a paw on gravel, the creak of a door hinge, the low hum of healing. Somewhere in the rhythm of those days, the lines began to blur. There's a story Travis often tells during outreach visits. Years ago, a cougar named Lacey arrived at Haven Ridge after being seized from a private owner. She'd been raised indoors, fed processed food, and declawed illegally. She was aggressive, unpredictable, and deeply mistrustful. Then a volunteer named Miguel started cleaning her enclosure. He never tried to interact. He just showed up. Same time, same voice, same pace, day after day. 6 months in, she began to wait by the door when he arrived. By the end of the year, she was greeting him with a low vocalization no one else ever heard. Not affection, recognition, not taming, trust. That story came up during one of Joanna's evening visits. Travis mentioned it as he handed her a cup of coffee and gestured toward Nova, who was now pacing gently, tail flicking alert, but unafraid. "She knows you," he said. Joanna didn't answer, but she smiled. As the weeks passed, other people began to notice. Visitors at the sanctuary would ask who the lady with the bobcat was. Volunteers commented on how Nova responded to Joanna's presence more than anyone else's. Even staff began scheduling their tasks around Joanna's visits to avoid disrupting the routine. And it wasn't just about presence anymore. Nova began responding to Joanna's voice even when she wasn't visible. She'd rise from her perch when Joanna read aloud. She'd pace the fence line when she arrived. One afternoon, she even mirrored Joanna's yawn with a long stretch and low grunt. "It's not anthropomorphism," Dr. Green reassured one skeptical intern. "It's responsiveness. It means she feels safe." Joanna wasn't trying to adopt Nova. That was never the point. She knew full well that bobcats, even rescued ones, don't belong in living rooms. They're not pets, no matter how sweet they seem. But that didn't mean they couldn't belong somewhere together. The bond wasn't about possession, it was about presence. A mutual agreement between two quiet souls that said in its own silent way, I know you're here. I know you see me. And sometimes that's more than enough. Sometimes that's... One afternoon, a woman named Clara visited the sanctuary. She was a board member and longtime supporter there to check on grant progress and discuss upcoming community events. She passed Joanna on the trail, offered a polite nod, and continued her tour. Later, she asked Travis who the woman was, the one sitting with the bobcat, in silence as if she belonged there. He replied simply, "That's Nova's person." There's something healing that happens when we're given permission to care for something outside ourselves, especially later in life, especially after loss. Joanna had spent over a year learning to live alone again after her husband passed. Her days were quiet, structured, familiar, but they lacked connection. Her hands missed doing things that mattered. And Nova, in all her bruised, silent glory, had given her back that purpose. Not in a dramatic, sweeping way, but slowly, gently, one careful visit at a time. We often underestimate what animals notice, but in sanctuary work, we learn quickly they notice everything: tone, rhythm, patterns. And when the world has taken from them what they needed most, autonomy, safety, dignity, what they crave above all else is consistency. Joanna offered that, without agenda, without demand, and Nova responded not with affection but with peace. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She stayed. There's a quiet lesson here that reaches beyond wildlife rescue. One that might even speak to those of us still navigating grief transition or loneliness. You don't have to fix something to be part of its healing. Sometimes your job is just to show up, to sit beside the wound, to stay when others walk away. That's what Joanna did for Nova, and it changed everything. By the third month, the sanctuary hosted a small open house event, a way to educate the public about wild animal rescue and gently discourage exotic pet ownership. Joanna didn't plan to attend as anything other than a helper, but when visitors approached the bobcat enclosure, Nova remained calm. She watched, blinked, stretched. Clara took note. Later that evening, she approached Joanna with an idea. What if Nova became the sanctuary's ambassador? Not in a performing way, but a presence, a story, a symbol. Joanna hesitated. "She's not mine." "No," Clara said, "but she chooses you." As Nova's story began to echo beyond the sanctuary walls, something unexpected unfolded. People from the town, some who had never cared about wildlife before, began showing up. And with them came something rare: hope stirred by a wild heart who once didn't have a chance. How one rescue cat, feral, forgotten and quiet, became the spark that changed a community. At first, Nova's story traveled the way most good stories do, quietly. A visitor at the sanctuary posted a photo, a wild cat baby resting under dappled sun eyes, alert, ear-tipped. The caption read, "Rescued, not tamed." A little survivor named Nova. Within hours, it was reshared dozens of times. By week's end, the image had made its way onto a local news station's human interest segment. That small moment sparked something bigger than anyone expected. Not viral in the flashy headline way, but steady, genuine. The kind of wildfire that moves underground before anyone notices the trees begin to bloom. Clara saw the potential first. She approached the board with a proposal: create a community campaign around Nova. Something more than a story. Something that could educate, raise awareness, and gently confront the growing crisis of exotic animal abandonment. They called it Wild Hearts. The goal was simple: use Nova's journey to start conversations. Not about blame, but about responsibility. Not about laws alone, but about compassion. Joanna didn't want the spotlight. She was content to stay in the rhythm she had with Nova. Quiet visits, unspoken understanding, but Clara insisted it wasn't about performance. "You already did the most important thing," she told Joanna. "You stayed." Wild Hearts began small. Posters in coffee shops, a short film screened at the public library, a children's reading circle featuring a handmade storybook about a baby bobcat lost in the woods. Then donations started coming in, not huge but steady. $10, $20. Someone sent $100 with a note for Nova and the ones like her we never hear about. The sanctuary used the funds to expand the outdoor enclosure, improve medical equipment, and hire a part-time educator to lead tours for local schools. At the heart of it all was Nova, no longer just the starving creature found in the forest, but a quiet symbol of what could happen when someone chooses to care. There was a boy named Liam who visited the sanctuary on a field trip with his third-grade class. He didn't speak much. Teachers said he rarely raised his hand. But when he saw Nova, something shifted. He stood still, just stared, then sat on the ground outside her enclosure and drew for nearly an hour, sketching her silhouette over and over again. Weeks later, his mother sent a letter. He talks about her every day. He even named his stuffed animal Nova. This is the first time he's connected with something outside of himself in months. Nova's impact wasn't just emotional, it became tangible. Shelter volunteers noted an increase in wildlife-related calls from rural areas nearby. People who had previously stayed silent about exotic pets in their neighborhoods now felt empowered to report what they saw. Not out of judgment, but out of protection for the animals and the people around them. At a town council meeting, an amendment was proposed to increase penalties for unlicensed ownership of wild animals. It passed unanimously. One council member stood up before the vote and said, "I never thought about this issue until I met a bobcat named Nova." There was another ripple no one had planned for. A local trauma recovery group for women invited Joanna to speak. Not formally, just to share how showing up for Nova had helped her through grief. Joanna hesitated. She wasn't used to speaking about herself, but she said yes. In that small room, sitting on a folding chair beside a table of half-eaten muffins, she told her story. She spoke of finding Nova, of feeling needed again, of watching a creature return to herself one slow breath at a time. There were no dry eyes when she finished. Afterward, one woman pulled her aside and said, "You reminded me it's not too late to reconnect with the world or with myself." There's a real-life example the sanctuary team often points to when explaining the importance of community engagement. In a nearby town, a wildlife center had taken in a serval that had been kept illegally for nearly 2 years. They tried to raise awareness about the situation but couldn't get traction. No one showed up to the fundraiser. Donations barely covered food. But when they tied the story to a local girl who had helped report the animal, a face, a voice, a feeling of shared hope, everything changed. The next event sold out. The community responded not to the animal alone, but to the connection. That's what Nova represented, a bridge between the unseen and the undeniable. Not everyone understood. There were a few who questioned the attention. "It's just a wild animal," someone commented on a news article. "What's the big deal?" But the people who had been watching closely knew better. Because Nova wasn't just anything. She was a mirror. She showed people what it looked like to be abandoned and still worth saving. To be wild and still worthy of compassion. To be broken and still become the beginning of something good. One Saturday morning, a group of kids from the local nature club gathered at the sanctuary to paint signs for the walking trail. Nova's enclosure was quiet as usual, but she stirred as the kids passed. She stood stretched and sat tall at the edge of her platform, watching. One child whispered, "It's like she knows we're here for her." Another replied, "She's the boss of this place." They laughed, but none of them forgot the moment. The Wild Hearts campaign didn't go national. It didn't need to. What it did was more powerful. It rooted itself in one town, one sanctuary, one story. And from there, it inspired small acts, people planting pollinator gardens for local wildlife schools, inviting biologists to speak, families choosing to adopt instead of buy. Conversations happened over dinner tables and park benches. Questions started getting asked. Who else needs help? What can I do? Where do I begin? There's a lesson here, simple but lasting. One life seen fully can make others feel seen too. Nova never asked for attention. She never purred on cue. She didn't pose for photos or perform. She just lived. She healed at her own pace. She trusted when she was ready, and she stayed wild even when people wanted her to be soft. That was the magic. People didn't fall in love with a domesticated mascot. They connected with a creature who kept her boundaries, her instincts, her fire, and still let someone close. That's what made it real. And yet, just as the community bloomed with new hope and Nova found her rhythm, something unexpected was about to surface. A letter, a name, a past, something no one, not even Joanna, was ready for. Because every life has roots, and sometimes those roots reach back toward something unresolved. A quiet message arrives from the shadows of Nova's story, and everything begins to shift. We step into the tension of ownership identity and what it really means to let go. The message came on a Thursday. Joanna was folding laundry in the volunteer cabin, chatting quietly with one of the new interns when Travis stepped in, holding a yellow envelope. It had no return address, just a single sentence typed neatly on the back flap. "I think the bobcat is ours." Inside was a short note. No name, no story, just a claim. Calm, unemotional. 4 typed words. She was ours first. Joanna felt her chest tighten. She sat down without meaning to. For weeks, Nova's story had been about healing connection and starting over. No one had asked where she came from. No one had imagined that someone somewhere might want her back. But now, someone had spoken. Travis and Clara moved fast. The sanctuary had clear legal protocols for situations like this. While bobcats are protected wildlife under state law, ownership laws vary county to county. The first step was to verify if the claim had merit. They responded through the legal contact listed on the sanctuary's website, inviting the sender to provide documentation. Most never do. But 3 days later, an email arrived. It contained 2 photographs, one of a young bobcat curled in a laundry basket, and another of what looked like the same animal, Nova, wearing a red collar and lying on a sunlit porch. More followed. Vet records, purchase receipts, a microchip registration from nearly a year prior issued in Georgia. Everything matched. Nova, it seemed, had once been named Fern. Clara called an emergency meeting. The room was tense quiet. Dr. Green read the file, slowly adjusting his glasses as he scrolled through the medical records. "They had her legally," he said softly. "At least until she crossed state lines." It turned out the original owners, a couple in their early 30s, had purchased Fern through a private breeder operating in a legal but loosely regulated market in Georgia. The breeder promised she was raised indoors, calm and bonded to humans. They hadn't known what they were signing up for. "She was sweet at first," the woman wrote in a follow-up email, "but she grew fast. She got unpredictable. The breeder stopped returning our calls. Then during a move she got out. We searched for weeks. They never reported it, never contacted wildlife authorities. We were scared," the man admitted later. "We didn't want to get in trouble." Joanna listened quietly as Travis read their words aloud. Part of her felt anger, hot, immediate. Another part felt something stranger, grief. Grief for the version of Nova that had lived that unnamed quiet life. Grief for the confusion of being passed from place to place. Grief for the people who perhaps had loved her in the wrong way, but had loved her still. The sanctuary's lawyer explained the situation plainly. Under current wildlife regulations, Nova was now protected as a rescue. The abandonment and illegal transport across state lines nullified the prior ownership. There was no legal path to reclaim her. Still, Clara reached out to the couple, not with hostility, but with humanity. Would they like to visit? To see her just once. They said yes. Joanna didn't sleep the night before they arrived. She wasn't afraid Nova would be taken. That part had been settled. But she didn't know what it would feel like to watch someone else say goodbye to the animal she now sat beside nearly every day. There were no camera crews, no announcements. The meeting happened quietly midweek before the sanctuary opened. The couple, Rachel and Evan, arrived holding hands, eyes wide. They looked tired, older than Joanna expected. Rachel carried a folder. Evan carried nothing. They stood outside the enclosure for a long time. Nova didn't approach. She watched from the back, ledge tail flicking ears alert. "She doesn't recognize us," Rachel said softly. Dr. Green, who stood beside them, nodded. "She's not the same cat anymore." Joanna stayed nearby but didn't interrupt. She watched Evan Neal slowly stare through the mesh and press his palm gently against the barrier. "I never wanted to let her go," he said to no one in particular. "We didn't know what we were doing." Rachel opened the folder. Inside was a sketch clearly drawn by hand. Nova as a cub, eyes too big for her face curled up in a blanket. On the bottom, a line in blue ink. "Even wild things need warmth." She offered it to Joanna. "You've given her what we couldn't," she said. Joanna took the drawing with trembling fingers. "I didn't do it alone," she replied. There's a real-life example Dr. Green brought up later that week. A lynx rescued from a backyard enclosure in Texas had been raised from infancy by a retired couple. They'd kept it well-fed, documented, and even walked it on a leash. But they had no permit. When the state seized the animal, the couple fought in court to get it back and won. A year later, the lynx escaped again. This time it was hit by a car and died. Sometimes, Dr. Green said, the kindest thing we can do is release our need to hold on. The visit ended with no drama. No tears, not visibly. Rachel and Evan stood for a while longer, then thanked the staff. They didn't ask for updates. They didn't linger. They left the drawing and walked away, hand in hand. Later that day, Clara placed the sketch in a frame and hung it in the volunteer room. Joanna sat with Nova longer than usual that evening. She didn't speak. Nova didn't move. But at one point, as the sun tilted low and lit the enclosure with gold, Nova padded over to the fence. She didn't touch it, just stood there, near. It felt like enough. There's a lesson here one most people miss. Loving something doesn't always mean keeping it. Sometimes love means stepping back and letting it grow into something new. Rachel and Evan didn't try to reclaim Nova. They didn't argue. They let her story unfold without trying to write themselves back into it. And Joanna, in turn, let go of the idea that love had to be exclusive. She'd been part of Nova's story, but not the whole of it, and that was okay. That night, Travis found Joanna standing by the bulletin board, looking at the framed sketch. "She was Fern," she said quietly. "Before she was Nova." He nodded. "Maybe she's both. Maybe she needed both names to get here." With Nova's past now known, the sanctuary looks toward what's next. What began as a single rescue has now become something larger, a movement, a message, a mirror held up to the hearts of a community. In the next chapter, Nova's impact goes public and her story begins to belong to everyone. It started with a poster. Just Nova's face, calm, alert, wild, and a short line beneath it, rescued but never tamed. Clara had designed it herself, printed 50 copies, and hung them in library windows, post office corkboards, and grocery store lobbies. Within days, people began asking questions. Who is she? Where can I learn more? Can we visit? What followed wasn't planned, not in any big strategy sort of way. But it felt inevitable. Because by then, Nova wasn't just a rescue bobcat. She was a story the town had started to tell together. The sanctuary's phones began ringing more often. Some callers asked about visiting hours. Others wanted to know how to donate. A few simply said, "I don't know why, but her eyes stayed with me." Then came the first school request. A 5th grade teacher named Mrs. Phelps reached out asking if her class could meet the famous wildcat who survived the woods. The sanctuary didn't allow public access to the animals, but they arranged something different. They invited the class to sit under the oak tree near Nova's enclosure, while Joanna read from a children's picture book someone had written about her story. Nova, curious but unbothered, watched from her perch, calm, like she understood the moment was hers. At the end, one student raised his hand and asked, "Do you think she remembers who tied her up?" Joanna paused, then said gently, "I think she remembers who stayed." The next week, Haven Ridge launched a new initiative called Pause and Learn, a monthly program combining wildlife education with storytelling and gentle reflection. The sanctuary grounds became a quiet hub for healing, not just for animals, but for people too. A woman who had recently lost her father came every Thursday. A teenager recovering from anxiety volunteered on weekends. A retired couple built a handmade bench beside Nova's enclosure and engraved it with the words, "Some strength is quiet." Nova never did tricks. She never played up to the crowd, but something about her presence invited stillness, thoughtfulness. Kids whispered when they passed. Adults lingered longer than they expected. She didn't do much. She just was. One Sunday afternoon, Travis received a letter from a local therapist. She worked with trauma survivors and had begun incorporating animal rescue stories into her sessions. She wrote, "Nova's journey helps people understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means building something beautiful anyway." That same month, the sanctuary hosted its first community open house. They expected 30 people. More than 200 came. There were no banners, no fanfare. Just information booths, quiet walking paths, and a single printed timeline outlining Nova's story from the forest to the fence to the sanctuary. Near the exit, a guest book lay open on a small table. People wrote messages like, "Thank you for reminding me the world still has kindness. I needed to see something survive. She made me want to protect more than just myself." There's a real-life example that mirrors what Nova created. In Oregon, a wildlife refuge rescued a one-eyed fox named Halo. After her story went public, not only did donations increase, but local schools rewrote their science curriculum to include weekly segments on animal behavior and empathy. A bakery donated profits from a Fox Friday sale. Children drew her picture on sidewalks with chalk. Animals don't speak, but when their stories are told with honesty and care, they teach us things we've forgotten how to say. The most unexpected ripple came from a local group of veterans who had heard about Nova through the grapevine. They contacted Clara and offered to build an ADA accessible walking path through the sanctuary for visitors with mobility issues. They didn't ask for publicity. They just said, "We know what it feels like to be caged in silence. This seems worth doing." 3 months later, that path opened. They named it the Quiet Trail. At the center, a small clearing with a wooden sign that read, "To all who stay, even when it's hard." Meanwhile, Nova's image appeared in more places, a mural outside the town's elementary school, a set of bookmarks for the library's reading challenge, a small feature in a regional magazine under the headline, "The Bobcat Who Helped a Town Remember Itself." Joanna found that phrase beautiful, "remember itself," because that's exactly what it felt like. Like people were waking up to something they'd forgotten how to slow down, how to feel deeply, how to act gently without spectacle. One afternoon, a teenage boy named Mason came to volunteer. He didn't say much, but after his first shift, he left a folded note in the feedback box. It read, "I thought I was the only one who felt disconnected. But if a wild animal can come back from that, maybe I can too." There's a quiet lesson in all of this, one that doesn't shout but lingers. Not every hero changes the world with noise. Some just exist, and in doing so, remind us how to care again. Nova didn't chase attention. She didn't go viral. She didn't need to. She was enough as she was. Fierce, guarded, present. And in her quiet recovery, she gave people permission to examine their own. To believe that maybe softness still had strength. That maybe gentleness wasn't weakness. That maybe the wild could heal us if we let it. The sanctuary now offers a short guide to visitors who ask about Nova's story. It includes facts about bobcats, how they live, what they need, why they're not pets. But it also offers questions. What does wildness mean to you? Where in your life have you been rescued? Who have you stayed for? Those who take the time to answer often leave changed. Clara says that every now and then someone will still call asking if Nova is adoptable. She gently tells them no, that she belongs to herself now, that some creatures are meant to remain wild. And people understand, because by now they've seen what freedom looks like when it's earned. There was a moment, months after the open house, when Joanna arrived early and found a small drawing taped to Nova's enclosure. Crayon on construction paper. A stick figure girl sitting beside a cat. Big eyes, bent ear, a sun in the corner. It said, "I love you, Nova. Thank you for helping me feel brave." Joanna didn't cry. She just folded it gently and placed it in her pocket. Some things are worth carrying. Just when the sanctuary finds its new rhythm, life offers another unexpected turn. A second message arrives, this time with a familiar name and a familiar ache. What happens when the past circles back one more time? What does it mean to truly belong? On a crisp morning in early fall, Joanna arrived before the gates opened. She walked slowly up the gravel path, holding 2 mugs of coffee, one for herself and one for Travis, who was already near Nova's enclosure. They didn't speak at first, just stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the bobcat stretch on her platform, then leap effortlessly to a shaded perch above. "She's different now," Travis finally said. Joanna smiled. "So am I." Nova was no longer the trembling wildcat baby found chained beneath pine trees. She moved with quiet confidence now. She ate regularly, responded to her name, and remained fiercely independent. Some days she allowed Joanna to sit near the fence for hours. Other days she kept her distance, but she was always present, always watching, and that presence, the fullness of her being, had become a kind of compass for the people around her. The sanctuary had grown too. Thanks to the Wild Hearts campaign, a second enclosure was under construction. Local artists donated murals. A nearby school district had added wildlife ethics to its science curriculum with Nova's story as the anchor. Volunteers came more consistently. Donations were steady, and visitors often arrived not just for education but for peace. "She reminds me that healing doesn't have to be loud," one guest wrote. "It can be still and strong and completely on your own terms." That fall, Haven Ridge hosted its first quiet celebration, a day without speakers, without music. Just open gates, walking paths, and reflection spaces. At the center was Nova, not performing, not confined, simply being. Some people watched her, others sat in silence nearby. A few stood alone, letting the story of her survival unfold in their own minds. There's a real-life practice in trauma recovery therapy called co-regulation through proximity. It means that sometimes just being near something calm, steady, and safe is enough to start healing. Nova did that. Not because she was tame, but because she was true. She didn't offer affection. She offered honesty. She didn't come when called, but she stayed when it mattered. And in doing so, she reminded people of something essential. Freedom isn't the absence of fences. It's the presence of choice. Joanna kept visiting, though less often now. Not because she loved Nova any less, but because she knew Nova didn't need her in the same way. And maybe Joanna didn't need Nova the same way either. What had started as rescue had become something mutual. They had steadied each other, but they had also grown in different directions. That was the gift. One morning, Joanna brought a small wooden plaque. She handed it to Travis without ceremony. He read it aloud. Home was never a cage. It was always the moment someone stayed. They hung it beside Nova's enclosure. Not for tourists, not for press, but for the ones who came quietly looking for something unnamed, something real. There's a lesson here, one not just for rescuers or animal lovers or people working in shelters. It's for all of us. We all carry wildness. Some part of us longs to be seen without being tamed. Some part of us knows what it feels like to be misunderstood, mislabeled, or left behind. And yet, like Nova, we are capable of becoming something whole, something free. Not because we forget what hurt us, but because we learn how to live around it. Because we remember who stayed, and we choose to stay for others too. Nova's story isn't rare because she was rescued. It's rare because someone noticed, because someone chose to care before the spotlight, because a town chose to learn, not just feel. Her life became more than a recovery. It became a reflection of us, of what it means to hold space for wild things, of what it means to give without claiming, of what it means to believe in second chances, not as miracles, but as quiet, deliberate acts. Today, Nova remains at Haven Ridge. Not on display, not hidden, just home. She greets each season with the same silent strength. She stretches in the sunlight, eats when she's hungry, disappears into the tall grasses when she wants solitude. She lives without needing to explain herself. And in that simple act, she continues to teach us. Now, maybe this story made you feel something. Maybe it reminded you of your own resilience. Maybe it made you think about the animals we don't see or the parts of ourselves we've caged for too long. Maybe you've rescued something wild, or maybe you've been rescued. Either way, I hope Nova's journey stays with you. I hope it reminds you that every wild cat baby, every animal rescue story, every quiet act of compassion matters. That even in a world full of noise, quiet healing is still powerful. So if this story stirred something in you, take a moment, reflect, share it. And if you want to stay connected, if you want more stories that remind you what matters, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join this community of quiet strength and shared heart. Because somewhere out there, another wild heart is waiting, and someone just like you might be the one who chooses to stay.